Okay, hi everybody. So earlier today, Dave explained a kind of overarching framework with which we've developed the NEST COTS research program. What I want to present now is the nuts and bolts of how we're going to implement that at the local scale to ecologically inform decision making. And I really am going to focus on decision making. We're going to hear talks from Morgan and from other people that are focused on the ecology and the field work that's going to inform that. When I talk about the local scale, what I mean is an individual dive site within a reef, or an entire reef, or a group of reefs that are close enough together we can consider them a single unit. And the sorts of decisions we want to inform are the day-to-day decisions about which sites we're going to dive at on a given reef, the decisions on kind of weekly timescales about where voyages are going to go, and the decisions over timescales of months about when a site or an entire reef can be considered to be effectively ecologically controlled. For this talk and this part of the NEST research program, what we're not focused on is how you select which reefs in a region you're going to target for COTS control over annual timescales. So Carlo's going to talk about that. He was going to talk next. Now he's going to talk when his plane gets in at the end of the next session. And these kinds of decisions are vitally important for the current control program, but they're also going to be important for future technologies and techniques, because with very few exceptions, all of the potential future technologies we have for controlling COTS are still going to be location-based. So we're still going to have to select sites at which to implement that control, decide how frequently we're going to go back to those sites, and have a criteria for when we can consider a site effectively controlled in an ecological sense. Now, a really simple caricature of the way the current control program works is we have a vessel in port and it gets directed out to a part of the GBR. It travels out to a specific reef and drops a team of 5 to 10 divers at a specific site on that reef. They then swim along and inject any COTS they see with a bowl salt solution. After 40 minutes, generally, or 80 minutes, they're pulled out of the water, they record how many COTS they've seen, and if they haven't finished the site, they'll dive at that same site again, and if they have, they'll dive at a different site on that reef, or they may move to a nearby reef and dive at a site there. After about 10 days, they then return back to port. So throughout that process, they make a number of key decisions, either explicitly or implicitly. So when they get to a reef, they have to decide which site at the reef they're going to dive on. They have to decide how many dives they're going to invest at that site, which is partly a function of how many COTS they find there. They need to decide how frequently they're going to dive at sites. So if they dived at a site on the previous voyage, are they going to dive at that same site on the current voyage? Or will they wait a couple of voyages and dive somewhere else on this voyage? And eventually they have to know or have a criteria for when they can consider that site effectively controlled. Now, some of these decisions are informed by conversations that go on in Garumpa offices or RRRC offices, but a lot of these take place on the water. So this is the cabin of Venus 2. This is the morning planning meeting where Matt, in the tartan shirt, is explaining to everyone at the sites they're going to dive at that day, based on the number of COTS they removed the previous day, based on the reefs they're expected to cover on that voyage, and based on really pragmatic things like the prevailing weather conditions. So those are the sorts of decisions that we want to provide an ecological basis for. And when I say we want to provide an ecological underpinning for those decisions, what I mean is that we want the temporal and spatial scale of the control program to reflect the temporal and spatial scale at which the COTS populations are spreading across the reefs. So to do that, we need to understand the ecology of the COTS, we need to understand how all the ecological processes interact, we need to understand how management fits into that ecological system in order to design an optimal control strategy. And you can do this. You can get all the best experts on COTS together and you can make a spaghetti diagram like that that tries to map out every important interaction. And it's actually really interesting in an intellectual or academic sense, and it's of practically no use to these guys on water when they have to decide which site they're going to dive at tomorrow. You can take all of that really refined knowledge and put it in a simulation model, and other people have tried and I've tried, and you can actually predict pretty well most of the time how many COTS they'll find at a site the next day. But unfortunately, the times that you don't get it right are really important. Some of the time you'll expect to find a lot of COTS and you won't find any at all, and even worse, some of the time you won't expect to find many COTS and you'll find a heap. So faced with a situation like that, you can either put a lot more investment into refining your model and trying to make it more powerful and more precise, or you can say, what's the easiest way that we can get the exact information we need to make the decision we need to make when we need to make it? So that was the first contribution that we made to the control program about 2 years ago now, and Cole talked about this earlier. We recommended that they implement mandatory surveillance at the start of each voyage to locate big aggregations of COTS and decide which sites they would dive on when they arrived at a reef. This was a little bit controversial when we were first started talking about it, because it requires pulling up to 3 divers out of the water that would otherwise be underwater, injecting and killing COTS. So the way that we worked this out was we analysed the historical data from the control program and showed that the benefits would outweigh the costs. And on an average voyage, you'd remove about over 30% more starfish, and with a big crew, you could remove well over 50% more starfish using this strategy. And fundamentally, this comes from the ecology of the system we're managing. Outbreaking COTS populations are highly clustered, and the COTS control program, the efficiency and effectiveness of it, is extremely responsive to how efficiently they can locate those clusters. So even with only 8 divers, it's still worth pulling 3 of them out of the water to locate those clusters, because the remaining 5 that are in the water will be able to kill more COTS and save more coral. So the next question we wanted to inform, which Dave touched on in his presentation, is how often we should revisit a site. And again, if you look at the ecology and you try to identify all the key ecological processes and all the information you'd need to make a decision, it turns out that there are 2 key processes that we need to focus on. One is the effective detection rate of the divers under the water, how many of the COTS that are there they find and kill, and the other is how quickly COTS move back into a control site after it's been controlled. And these are really key ecological and management processes. They've been studied before, and it turns out that a lot of those historical studies, although while very intellectually interesting, were not at the right scales to inform the decisions that needed to be made on water. And so we said, can we go back to that control program data and extract the information we need to make this decision? And we could do that because the 2 processes have distinct ecological effects on the number of COTS you remove. Basically, if you are fundamentally limited by detectability, then if you revisit a site multiple times, eventually the COTS that you find there will be dominated by the ones that are the hardest to detect, which are the smallest COTS. If you are limited more by immigration, then as you go back and revisit a site you've already controlled, your cull will start to be dominated by the COTS that can move fastest, which are the biggest COTS back into the control sites. When you analyse the control program data, basically we find more of an effect, more of a skew towards small size classes after repeated revisitations than you would expect based on traditional understandings of how important detectability and immigration are to COTS control strategies. So this is a really subtle and complicated diagram, and I'm not going to go into the details. Both of these, just to be really clear, both of these processes do apply. We do have issues around detectability, and we do have issues around COTS moving back into control sites. But compared to what we thought we had, we suspect that detectability is a bigger issue than we first suspected. And that makes a difference because the optimal control strategy is quite different. What I've got displayed up here on the top line, well, both of those are two different control strategies visiting a single site 8 times over a year. In a system that has been artificially constrained by detectability. So this is a simulation. In the top row, we see that if you are constrained by detectability, your best strategy when you first start managing a reef or a site is to go in and hit it hard, time and time and time again, really quickly, to get that COTS population down. Historically, what we've tended to do is more that bottom line, where we've visited a site every 3 months, every 6 weeks if we have the resources. And by the end of the year, the outcome is kind of similar in terms of the number of COTS we've removed and the number of COTS that remain on the reef. But what's different is that bottom strategy has lost more than twice as much coral as the top strategy. So it's a really significant effect. This isn't a subtle effect. So if we think about every decision that we would have to make, every decision like the 2 examples I've just shown you, in order to run an on-water control program, and we think about every piece of information we would need to ecologically inform that decision, what you end up with is something called a decision tree that looks something like this. And it looks a little bit complicated there, but that is every decision you need to make on a vessel to run the on-water control program. And each of those boxes is a relatively simple thing. It's either a single control action, a very simple piece of data analysis, or a yes or no question. So this is the framework that will allow us to ensure that all the decisions that have been made in the control program have a solid ecological underpinning. This is the point we're at now. We're working closely with Garumpa and RRC and control program operators to ensure that the new expanded program is underpinned by a framework like this, so that all the decisions that are being made have a solid ecological basis. So that's the theory, that's the framework. The way that we implement this on water is called the COTS Control Centre. And it's a piece of hardware and software that control program operators can take from their office out to the cabin on their vessel, and it helps them make those decisions in an ecologically informed manner. Normally I run this demonstration live off the tablet. For the venue today I'm using pre-recorded videos, so I'll try to keep up. The system does several things. This example is showing a historical voyage. On the left we have, that occurred I think in April last year. On the left we have all the dives that occurred during that voyage, the number of COTS that were removed on each dive, and on the right we have a graphical representation of where those COTS were removed. On the left we also have an estimate of the amount of coral saved by the actions taken during that voyage. And that's vital because we're not out there trying to kill the most COTS, we're out there trying to save the most coral. So it's important to put that information in front of the control program operators so that when they're making decisions, they make decisions that save the most coral. We're not aiming to take control program operators out of the decision-making system because they're the ones that are out there every day. They understand the system best, but we are aiming to give them the insights they need to make sure the decisions they make are more ecologically informed. So if they're at a site today, they can look back at all the culls that were done at that site since the start of the modern control program in 2013 and look to see how their cull numbers compare to those historical numbers and whether it looks like the site that they're managing is being effectively ecologically controlled. But the real foundation of the COTS Control Centre is this Plan New Voyage module. And it takes all the data that is going to be available to us under the new expanded control program from a fleet of vessels, all the cull data, all the surveillance data, and it tells us which reefs and which sites we should visit on the next voyage in order to create the greatest ecological impact. So what we've got here is the system has been given a few constraints in terms of the region of the reef it has to operate, and it's mapped out a voyage to generate the biggest possible ecological protection of coral on the next voyage. The system uses an advanced ecological management population model coupled with that intensive data collection we now have the capacity to generate through the expanded control program with 8 vessels, and filters it through that decision tree to ensure or to overcome those limitations I talked about earlier in predicting which sites we should visit using a model to create the greatest ecological benefit. So, and a key part of that is it keeps track of how accurate and how precise it's been, and if it needs more information to make a reliable prediction, then it will ask for it. So it will not just structure the culling actions, but also the man-to-toe actions to collect the data it needs to make effective decisions. So that's it. That's the system we've designed with input from control program operators, from Garumpa, from everybody that's been working in this space, from all our research partners, in order to ensure that decisions made at the local scale have a solid ecological underpinning. Thank you very much.